Small businesses aren't disappearing because they failed. They're disappearing because the economy no longer needs them. More shops are open. More people call themselves entrepreneurs. More transactions are happening every day. And yet, ownership is vanishing, quietly, systematically, without anyone announcing it. You walk down a familiar street that once felt alive. The signs are still there. The lights are on. The storefronts look occupied. Coffee is being poured. Food is being served. Packages are moving. On the surface, nothing appears broken. And yet, something fundamental has disappeared. Not loudly, not dramatically, no headlines. No emergency meetings, no televised collapse. Just a quiet erasure that most people sense but cannot fully articulate. Small businesses are not failing in the way they used to. There is no single shock, no sudden wave of bankruptcies that would trigger panic or policy intervention. Instead, they are vanishing through absorption, conversion, and quiet surrender. A restaurant does not close. It becomes a delivery node. A shop does not shut down. It becomes a fulfillment partner. A family business does not go bankrupt. It sells its soul to a platform and survives as a shell of what it once was. The economy counts this as stability. The data records continuity. But ownership, autonomy, and economic agency are quietly erased. This is why the disappearance feels invisible. Traditional economic indicators are not designed to detect the loss of independence. They measure output, employment, transaction volume, and revenue flows. They do not measure who controls the business, who sets the terms, or who absorbs the risk. When a local store closes and is replaced by a franchise, the statistics often improve. When an independent driver becomes a platform contractor, employment remains intact. When a craftsman becomes a seller inside a marketplace, commerce appears to grow. The economy looks healthy precisely because it no longer distinguishes between ownership and dependency. In recent years, global data has shown a paradox that economists struggle to explain publicly, but understand privately. Business creation rates remain elevated, yet business longevity continues to decline. New registrations rise while long-term survival collapses. This is not entrepreneurial dynamism. It is churn, an economy optimized for turnover rather than endurance. Small businesses are born into an environment where their lifespan is structurally shortened, not because they lack demand, but because they lack leverage. World Bank and OECD data reveal that the average age of small enterprises has been falling across developed economies for over a decade. At the same time, market concentration ratios continue to rise. Fewer firms control a larger share of revenue, logistics, advertising, and customer access. This combination is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of an economy that rewards scale over resilience. The market no longer asks whether a business is viable. It asks whether it is scalable. If the answer is no, the business is tolerated only temporarily. What makes this process difficult to see is that it does not resemble destruction. It resembles modernization. Digital tools promise efficiency. Platforms promise reach. Financial products promise flexibility. Each individual decision made by a small business owner appears rational. Join the platform to survive. Accept higher fees to stay visible. Sacrifice margin for volume. Trade control for access. None of these choices feel like surrender in isolation. Together, they form a one-way transition from ownership to dependency. Governments reinforce this illusion through well-intentioned but structurally irrelevant support programs. Subsidies, grants, and loans are framed as lifelines, yet they rarely address the core problem. Capital access does not solve pricing power. Temporary relief does not restore negotiating leverage. A small business can receive funding and still be trapped in the system where suppliers, landlords, platforms, and financiers extract value upstream. The business survives on paper, while its economic freedom erodes in reality. The pandemic years accelerated this transformation, but they did not create it. What appeared to be an emergency response revealed an underlying preference built into the system. Large firms consolidated, platforms expanded, logistics networks centralized. Small businesses adapted or disappeared. Recovery narratives celebrated resilience, but the structure of the economy shifted permanently. What returned was activity, not autonomy. This is why streets can look busy while ownership thins out. This is why employment numbers can stabilize while entrepreneurship declines. This is why economic growth can coexist with widespread insecurity among business owners. The economy has learned how to preserve output without preserving independence. It has learned how to maintain consumption without maintaining competition. It has learned how to function without small businesses as sovereign entities. From an investor's perspective, this shift is logical. Scale reduces volatility. Centralization simplifies forecasting. Platforms generate predictable cash flows. From a policymaker's perspective, it reduces systemic risk. Fewer large entities are easier to monitor and support than millions of small ones. From the perspective of the small business owner, however, it represents a quiet loss of status. They are no longer a pillar of the economy. They are a temporary configuration within it. The most dangerous aspect of this transition is not the disappearance itself, but the normalization of it. When independence becomes optional, it stops being protected. When ownership becomes inefficient, it stops being encouraged. When small businesses are framed as lifestyle choices rather than economic engines, their decline becomes politically invisible. No one announces their deletion because statistically, nothing is wrong. Yet beneath the surface, the economic contract has changed. The promise that effort, risk, and discipline could build something lasting has been replaced by a different offer. Participate, comply, adapt, and remain useful for as long as the system requires you. The economy did not turn against small businesses. It simply evolved beyond needing them in their traditional form. And that is why their disappearance feels so unsettling. Not because they are gone, but because the economy continues as if nothing was lost. What ultimately destroys small businesses is not incompetence, poor service, or lack of demand. It is scale. Scale is not just an advantage in the modern economy. It is a weapon. And like all effective weapons, it is controlled by those who already have power, capital, and access. The market still calls this competition, but the rules have changed so profoundly that the word no longer means what it once did. Scale rewrites cost structures. A large corporation does not buy raw materials at the same price as a small producer. It does not borrow money at the same interest rate. It does not negotiate rent, logistics, insurance, advertising, or energy under the same conditions. Every layer of the economic stack bends in favor of the largest players. What looks like a minor percentage difference at each level compounds into an insurmountable gap. By the time a product reaches the consumer, the small business is fighting an enemy it cannot see and cannot match. Cheap capital is the first and most decisive advantage. For more than a decade, global monetary policy flooded financial markets with liquidity. Central banks lowered interest rates to historic lows and kept them there. This money did not flow evenly. It pooled around institutions with collateral, political relevance, and market presence. Large corporations refinanced endlessly, issued bonds, and rolled debt at costs that small businesses could never access. Even when rates eventually rose, the legacy of cheap capital remained embedded in corporate balance sheets. This is why large firms can operate with margins that would kill a small business. They can tolerate losses for years. They can subsidize one division with profits from another. They can use pricing as a strategic tool rather than a survival constraint. A small business must price to live. A large corporation can price to eliminate competition. This is not predatory behavior in the old legal sense. It is structural dominance enabled by financial architecture. Scale also changes time horizons. Small businesses live month to month. Cash flow determines survival. One bad quarter can erase years of effort. Large firms operate on multi-year horizons. They can absorb shocks, delay profitability, and invest through downturns. When crises hit, this asymmetry becomes fatal. Recessions, pandemics, supply chain disruptions, and inflationary spikes act as filters. They remove fragile entities and leave behind those built for endurance. Endurance, however, is no longer a function of good management. It is a function of size. Economic data increasingly reflects this reality. Across advanced economies, productivity growth concentrates inside large firms, while stagnating or declining among smaller ones. Wage growth follows the same pattern. Investment flows do not seek innovation alone, they seek scale. Venture capital does not ask whether a business can be sustainable, it asks whether it can dominate. If the answer is no, the business is classified as non-investable, regardless of how valuable it may be to a community or an economy. Technology amplifies this dynamic rather than neutralizing it. Digital tools were once presented as equalizers. Cloud services, online advertising, global marketplaces, and remote logistics were supposed to lower barriers to entry. In practice, they raised them. These tools reward volume. Algorithms favor velocity. Visibility is auctioned, not earned. A small business can technically access the same platforms as a multinational, but it cannot compete within them. Participation is open, success is not. Marketing provides a clear example. Large firms spread advertising costs across millions of transactions. Data collection improves targeting. Brand recognition compounds. Small businesses pay higher marginal costs for less predictable results. As platforms monetize attention, the price of visibility rises. What once required creativity now requires capital. The small business does not lose customers because it is worse. It loses because it is unseen. Logistics follows the same logic. Scale compresses delivery costs, storage expenses, and supply chain volatility. Large firms internalize logistics or negotiate preferential rates. Small businesses pay retail prices for wholesale infrastructure. When supply chains tighten, the largest players are prioritized. When capacity returns, they expand further. Every disruption increases concentration. Every recovery cements it. From a market efficiency perspective, this looks rational. Fewer suppliers reduce complexity. Larger firms stabilize output. Predictability increases. But efficiency is not neutral. It selects winners. It defines who is allowed to exist. An economy optimized purely for efficiency will always sacrifice diversity. Small businesses are not inefficient because they are poorly run. They are inefficient because they refuse to become something else. Scale also reshapes labor markets in ways that indirectly crush small firms. Large employers offer stability, benefits, and predictable income. Small businesses cannot match this without destroying margins. As workers gravitate toward security, small firms face higher turnover, training costs, and wage pressure. The narrative becomes self-reinforcing. Small businesses are framed as risky workplaces. Large firms become default employers. The talent gap widens. None of this requires conspiracy or coordination. The system functions automatically. Incentives align. Capital flows towards scale. Regulation adapts to the largest stakeholders. Infrastructure is built for volume. Risk models favor incumbents. The result is an economy where competition exists only within size categories. Small businesses do not compete with corporations. They orbit them, supply them, or disappear. The tragedy is that this transformation is often misinterpreted as natural evolution. In reality, it is policy encoded into structure. Monetary decisions, regulatory frameworks, financial market design, and technological infrastructure all privilege size. Once embedded, these advantages persist regardless of intent. Even well-meaning reforms struggle to reverse them because doing so would reduce efficiency, growth metrics, and short-term stability. This is why the disappearance of small businesses accelerates during periods of economic stress and never fully reverses afterward. Each shock removes another layer of independent actors. Each recovery rebuilds around those who survived. Over time, the market no longer remembers how to function differently. Scale becomes the baseline. Everything else becomes marginal. And for the small business owner, this reality manifests not as a single moment of failure, but as constant pressure. Margins shrink, costs rise, negotiating power evaporates. Survival requires concessions that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. At some point, the question is no longer how to grow, but whether growth is even possible without surrendering control. This is the true role of scale in the modern economy. It does not merely reward success. It defines legitimacy. It decides who is allowed to compete, who must comply, and who quietly exits without leaving a trace. Scale does more than compress costs and stretch time horizons. It reshapes the very meaning of risk, and this is where the final barrier becomes insurmountable for small businesses. Risk in the modern economy is no longer shared evenly. It is asymmetrically distributed downward. Large firms externalize it. Small firms absorb it. The market treats this as efficiency. In reality, it is a structural transfer of vulnerability. Large corporations do not fail the way small businesses do. When a small business miscalculates demand, it closes. When a large firm miscalculates demand, it restructures, lays off workers, spins off assets, refinances debt, or secures emergency liquidity. Failure is transformed into a financial event rather than an existential one. This difference is not about competence. It is about access to mechanisms that convert loss into delay. Financial markets play a central role in this conversion. Publicly traded corporations are embedded in a permanent safety net of investors, lenders, and policymakers who have a vested interest in their survival. Their collapse would ripple through pensions, indexes, credit markets, and political narratives. As a result, their risks are implicitly socialized. Small businesses, by contrast, exist outside this protection. Their failure is localized, statistically insignificant, and therefore acceptable. Insurance follows the same logic. Large firms negotiate coverage at scale, hedge exposures, and self-insure entire segments of risk. Small businesses pay standardized premiums that rise precisely when conditions worsen. During periods of inflation, energy shocks, or supply chain disruption, insurance costs surge. The large firm absorbs this as a line item. The small business absorbs it as a threat to survival. Regulation, often assumed to protect smaller players, reinforces the asymmetry. Compliance costs are largely fixed. Reporting requirements, legal standards, data protection rules, labor regulations, and environmental mandates do not scale proportionally. A large firm spreads these costs across thousands of employees and billions in revenue. A small business carries them personally. What is framed as protection becomes friction. What is framed as fairness becomes exclusion. Credit markets further entrench this divide. After years of monetary tightening and financial stress, banks became increasingly risk-averse towards small borrowers. Collateral requirements rose. Lending standards tightened. Meanwhile, large firms retained access to bond markets, private credit, and structured financing. Even as headlines spoke of higher interest rates, the effective cost of capital remained deeply unequal. For small businesses, capital became scarce and conditional. For large firms, it became strategic. This divergence has measurable consequences. Across multiple economies, data shows that during periods of rising rates and slowing growth, corporate profits at the top decouple from small business earnings. Concentration increases, market share shifts upward. The system does not correct itself. It consolidates. Each cycle leaves fewer independent actors behind. Technology platforms accelerate this consolidation under the banner of efficiency. By controlling discovery, payment, logistics, and customer relationships, platforms redefine what it means to operate a business. The small business no longer owns demand. It rents access to it. It no longer controls pricing. It responds to algorithmic signals. It no longer builds a customer base. It serves traffic allocated by systems it cannot audit or influence. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that it is framed as choice. Participation is voluntary. No one is forced to join a platform, but refusal often means invisibility. The market punishes absence more severely than dependency. Over time, opting out becomes economically irrational. The small business survives by integrating deeper into systems that erode its autonomy. Survival and surrender merge into the same decision. Labor dynamics complete the trap. As large firms absorb talent and normalize standardized employment, small businesses are left competing for a shrinking pool of workers willing to accept uncertainty. Wages rise faster than productivity for small firms. Benefits expectations increase. Flexibility becomes a liability rather than an advantage. The labor market evolves towards stability, not entrepreneurship. This shift is subtle but decisive. Without labor, scale cannot be challenged. From a macroeconomic perspective, none of this triggers alarms. Output remains stable. Employment persists. Consumption continues. Inflation is measured. Growth resumes. The system appears resilient. But resilience has been redefined. It no longer means adaptability across many actors. It means durability concentrated in a few. The result is an economy where competition still exists, but only among giants. Small businesses are permitted to exist at the margins, in niches too small to matter or too localized to threaten scale. They are no longer engines of growth. They are cultural artifacts, symbols of variety rather than sources of power. For the small business owner, this reality manifests as constant compromise. Accept thinner margins, accept less control, accept higher risk, accept dependency as the price of relevance. Over time, the original promise of entrepreneurship erodes. Ownership becomes symbolic. Independence becomes conditional. What remains is activity without authority. This is why scale is not merely an advantage. It is the filter through which the modern economy selects who belongs. Those who possess it are protected, financed, and normalized. Those who do not are exposed, replaceable, and quietly removed, not through collapse, but through design. The most dangerous trap for small businesses in the modern economy is not declining demand. It is rising activity paired with disappearing profit. Revenue grows, customers remain, operations continue, yet the business slowly suffocates. This is the cost trap, and it is designed to be invisible. It does not announce itself as a crisis. It presents itself as normal inflation, market adjustment, or temporary pressure. But structurally, it is the mechanism that finishes what scale began. In previous economic eras, growth in revenue usually meant growth in resilience. Higher sales created buffers, margins absorbed shocks, expansion created optionality. Today, that relationship is broken. Small businesses increasingly report a paradoxical reality. They are busier than ever, yet poorer in outcome. More transactions produce less security. More effort yields less control. This is not mismanagement. It is arithmetic imposed from the outside. The first component of the cost trap is rent. Commercial real estate has transformed from an input into a speculative asset class. Small businesses do not rent space from landlords who prioritize long-term tenants. They rent from balance sheets optimized for yield. As interest rates rose globally, landlords passed financing costs downward. Rent adjustments outpaced revenue growth in most service sectors. Even businesses with stable demand faced renegotiations that erased profitability overnight. Relocation was rarely an option because new locations reflected the same dynamic. Geography stopped being a solution. Energy costs followed a similar path. Volatility replaced predictability. Price spikes were absorbed differently depending on size. Large firms hedged, negotiated contracts, or diversified supply. Small businesses paid spot prices. When global energy shocks hit, they appeared in monthly bills without warning. Governments offered temporary relief, but the structural shift remained. Energy became a variable cost that small firms could not smooth, only endure. Logistics, once a background function, became a strategic bottleneck. Shipping rates surged during global disruptions, then normalized unevenly. Large firms locked in contracts during downturns and expanded capacity during recoveries. Small businesses re-entered markets at higher baseline costs. Even when headline prices fell, access did not equalize. Priority lanes, guaranteed capacity, and volume discounts preserved asymmetry. What looked like recovery concealed permanent disadvantage. Then there are platform fees. These are rarely framed as costs in the traditional sense. They are described as service charges, commissions, or convenience fees. Individually, they appear manageable. Collectively, they drain margin. Payment processors take a cut. Marketplaces take another. Advertising platforms auction visibility. Delivery services extract percentages. Each layer claims to provide access, not dependency, but the cumulative effect is profound. Small businesses increasingly operate with double-digit portions of revenue diverted before profit is even possible. Raising prices seems like the obvious response. In practice, it rarely works. Consumers face their own pressures. Price sensitivity increases during inflationary periods. Platforms amplify competition by displaying alternatives instantly. Large firms absorb margin compression temporarily to maintain market share. Small businesses cannot. They raise prices and lose volume, or hold prices and lose viability. The choice is not strategic, it is constrained. Labor costs complete the trap. Wage growth accelerated across many economies, driven by inflation, demographic shifts, and labor shortages. For large firms, higher wages were offset by automation, pricing power, and scale efficiencies. For small businesses, wages are not an adjustable variable. They are a moral and operational necessity. Owners cut their own income first, then ours, then services. Eventually, quality erodes. The business survives, but the value proposition weakens. This pressure creates a distorted picture in economic data. Employment remains stable. Business counts remain elevated. Activity indicators show resilience. But profit margins at the small business level compress steadily. Surveys reveal rising stress, declining optimism, and shortened planning horizons. Owners no longer think in years, they think in months. Investment stops. Maintenance is delayed. Innovation disappears. The business becomes reactive rather than generative. The cost trap also alters behavior in subtle ways. Risk tolerance declines. Entrepreneurs avoid experimentation. They choose safer offerings with lower upside. This reduces differentiation and intensifies competition, further pressuring margins. The market becomes crowded with similar offerings chasing shrinking profitability. What appears as oversupply is often desperation. Financial statements reflect this erosion imperfectly. Accounting captures revenue and expense, not fragility. A business can appear solvent while operating one shock away from collapse. A delayed payment, a broken appliance, a regulatory fine, or a short illness can trigger failure. Resilience has vanished, replaced by continuous exposure. From a macroeconomic perspective, this fragility is acceptable because it is decentralized. No single failure matters. The system absorbs loss quietly. Replacement businesses emerge quickly, often under worse conditions. Churn is mistaken for dynamism. In reality, it is evidence of structural exhaustion. This is why policy responses consistently miss the target. Tax relief, subsidies, and grants address symptoms, not structure. They provide temporary oxygen without restoring breathing capacity. Costs continue to rise. Pricing power remains absent. Dependency deepens. The trap resets. For the small business owner, the psychological toll is severe. Effort disconnects from outcome. Long hours no longer translate into security. Passion becomes obligation. Pride turns into maintenance. Many continue, not because it is profitable, but because exit feels like failure. This emotional capital is extracted alongside financial capital, sustaining businesses that would otherwise close. The cost trap is not an accident of inflation or bad timing. It is the result of an economy that externalizes volatility downward. Stability is purchased at the expense of those least able to bear uncertainty. Small businesses do not collapse because they are inefficient. They collapse because they are exposed. And the most dangerous aspect is that exposure grows with participation. The more integrated a business becomes, the more cost it accumulates, the less flexibility it retains. Growth deepens the trap instead of escaping it. Expansion multiplies vulnerability. This is the silent mechanism that turns active streets into fragile ecosystems. Commerce continues. Lights stay on. Transactions flow. But beneath the surface, profit disappears. Resilience erodes. And survival becomes a daily calculation. The economy does not notice the difference because output remains. Only ownership feels the loss. The final stage of the cost trap is reached when rising expenses stop being perceived as temporary pressure and become embedded expectations. At this point, the small business no longer plans for relief. It plans for endurance. This shift is subtle but decisive. Once a business internalizes permanent stress, its behavior changes in ways that lock the trap in place. One of the most overlooked elements is financing under pressure. As margins shrink, small businesses increasingly rely on short-term credit to smooth operations. Lines of credit, deferred payments, supplier financing, and payment plans become structural rather than occasional tools. This creates a feedback loop. Interest expenses rise precisely when profitability weakens. Cash flow volatility increases. Creditworthiness deteriorates. The cost of capital climbs further. What began as a bridge becomes a weight. Unlike large firms, small businesses cannot refinance strategically. They do not issue bonds. They do not roll debt across cycles. They service obligations in real time. Missed payments are not restructured. They are penalized. Credit scores fall, terms worsen. The business enters a narrowing corridor where survival depends on flawless execution in an environment designed for error. Taxation compounds the problem in ways rarely discussed publicly. Most tax systems are calibrated for revenue, not margin. Sales taxes, value-added taxes, payroll contributions, and fixed fees do not adjust dynamically to profitability. A business can owe taxes even while operating at a loss. Large firms offset this through accounting optimization, international structures, and deferred liabilities. Small businesses pay as they go. Compliance becomes another fixed cost layered onto shrinking margins. Inflation further distorts perception. When prices rise everywhere, cost increases are framed as universal. This creates political cover for inaction. Yet inflation is not neutral. It benefits debtors with pricing power and punishes operators without it. Large firms raise prices ahead of cost increases, protect margins, and report record profits. Small businesses react after costs rise, absorb the gap, and appear inefficient by comparison. The same macro environment produces opposite outcomes depending on scale. Consumer behavior also shifts in ways that deepen the trap. As households face pressure, they prioritize predictability. They gravitate toward brands perceived as stable, standardized, and reversible. Refund policies, customer support, and brand familiarity become decisive. Small businesses lose on perception, not quality. Trust migrates upward. Loyalty becomes conditional. Price sensitivity intensifies. The room for differentiation shrinks. This change is visible in data, but rarely interpreted correctly. Surveys show declining consumer attachment to local businesses despite expressed preference for them. The contradiction reflects constrained choice. Values yield to budgets. Intent yields to algorithms. The market does not reward sentiment. It rewards scale. The cost trap also alters competitive dynamics among small businesses themselves. As survival becomes the priority, cooperation declines. Collective bargaining weakens. Shared infrastructure dissolves. Each business negotiates alone against landlords, platforms, and suppliers that operate at scale. Fragmentation increases vulnerability. What once functioned as an ecosystem becomes a field of isolated actors. This isolation has macro consequences. Small businesses historically functioned as shock absorbers. They adapted locally, adjusted quickly, and redistributed income within communities. As their resilience erodes, shocks transmit faster and deeper. Closures cluster. Employment disruptions become regional. Recovery slows. Yet because these effects are dispersed, they rarely trigger systemic alarms. From an investor's perspective, this environment clarifies incentives. Capital avoids fragility. It seeks predictability, margin stability, and scalability. Small businesses trapped in rising cost structures become unattractive, not because they lack purpose, but because the system cannot extract growth from them without assuming risk. Investment flows upward. Innovation follows capital. The gap widens. Media narratives reinforce misunderstanding. Stories focus on individual failures, not structural pressure. The struggling cafe, the closed shop, the burned-out founder. These are framed as cautionary tales, not evidence of design. Responsibility is personalized. Structure disappears from view. The lesson becomes behavioral rather than economic. At the psychological level, the trap is devastating. Owners experience a continuous mismatch between effort and outcome. They work longer hours to preserve what is already lost. Burnout becomes common, but exit feels worse. Identity is tied to survival. Quitting feels like surrender rather than rational response. This emotional lock-in sustains the system longer than economics alone could. Eventually, the business reaches a point where any growth increases risk faster than reward. Hiring becomes dangerous. Expansion becomes exposure. Innovation becomes liability. The rational choice is stagnation. The business survives by standing still, even as the environment moves. Over time, standing still becomes falling behind. From the outside, nothing dramatic occurs. The business remains open. Transactions continue. Employees show up. Customers visit. The economy records activity. But internally, the business is hollowed out. Profit has vanished. Optionality is gone. One unexpected event can end everything. This is the completion of the cost trap. It does not destroy businesses suddenly. It converts them into fragile operators that exist at the pleasure of systems they do not control. They are active but powerless, visible but replaceable, working but not accumulating. The economy tolerates this because it maintains output. It accepts fragility as long as it is decentralized. Stability at the top is preserved by volatility below. The system functions smoothly precisely because small businesses absorb the shocks quietly. And this is why the cost trap is so effective. It leaves no ruins, no dramatic collapse, no clear villain. It replaces resilience with exposure, profit with activity, and ownership with obligation. By the time the business disappears, the economy has already moved on, and nothing in the data suggests that anything valuable was ever there. At a certain point, the small business owner notices that nothing is truly theirs anymore. Not the customer relationship, not the pricing, not the distribution, not even the rhythm of their own work. The transition is subtle and rarely acknowledged, but it marks a fundamental shift in the nature of entrepreneurship. The owner does not fail. They are reclassified. From proprietor to operator, from decision maker to executor, from independent economic actor to managed node inside a larger system. This transformation is not enforced by law or decree. It emerges through infrastructure. Platforms do not seize businesses, they absorb functions. One by one, the elements that once defined ownership are outsourced, automated, or conditional. Payments are processed elsewhere. Visibility is controlled by algorithms. Customer data is retained by intermediaries. Logistics are handled by third parties. Even pricing is guided by dashboards and dynamic suggestions. The business still carries the risk, but no longer holds authority. The language surrounding this shift is deliberately benign. Platforms speak of empowerment, tools, reach, and opportunity. They promise to reduce friction and unlock growth. For a time, this appears true. Revenue increases, volume expands, exposure multiplies. But the trade is asymmetric. The small business gains access. The platform gains control. And control, once ceded, is rarely returned. The most critical loss is ownership of demand. Historically, a business cultivated customers directly. Loyalty was personal. Reputation was local. Switching costs favored the seller. In the platform economy, demand is abstracted. Customers belong to the interface, not the business. Search rankings, recommendation engines, and sponsored placement determine visibility. The relationship is mediated. A small change in an algorithm can erase years of effort overnight. There is no appeal, no negotiation, no explanation. Dependency replaces loyalty. Pricing follows the same pattern. Dynamic pricing tools suggest optimal ranges based on market data. Competing offers are displayed side by side. Undercutting becomes constant. Large firms use these systems strategically, sacrificing margin to dominate. Small businesses follow the signals or disappear. The market no longer reflects value or cost. It reflects algorithmic equilibrium optimized for volume and engagement, not sustainability. Control over branding erodes quietly. Visual identity is standardized. Communication is templated. Customer interaction is routed through platform channels. Reviews become currency, often detached from context or nuance. Reputation is quantified and ranked. A single negative event can outweigh hundreds of satisfied transactions. Large firms absorb reputational volatility through scale. Small businesses are exposed to it fully. Data asymmetry completes the shift. Platforms observe everything. Conversion rates, browsing behavior, pricing elasticity, and demand patterns are aggregated and analyzed continuously. Small businesses see fragments. They receive dashboards designed to optimize participation, not independence. Strategic insight flows upward. Execution flows downward. The platform learns. The operator reacts. This asymmetry allows platforms to compete with their own participants. Successful products are identified, replicated, and promoted under platform-owned brands. Terms of service permit this. The small business becomes a test environment. Innovation is extracted. Margins migrate upward. What appears as partnership functions as surveillance. Labor dynamics adapt accordingly. The owner's role becomes operational rather than strategic. Time is consumed by compliance, optimization, and responsiveness. Metrics replace intuition. Dashboards replace judgment. Workdays stretch, but agency shrinks. The owner works inside the business rather than on it, not by choice, but by necessity. Delegation becomes risky. Automation is imposed externally. Financial reporting masks this degradation. Revenue remains, employment persists, transactions flow. From the outside, the business appears alive. From the inside, it feels constrained. Growth no longer increases freedom. It increases obligations. Higher volume triggers higher fees, stricter standards, and deeper dependency. Expansion tightens the leash. This transformation is reinforced by capital markets. Investors favor platform-mediated models because they offer predictable extraction of value without direct operational risk. They reward businesses that intermediate rather than produce. This shifts innovation away from ownership toward orchestration. The small business owner is not invited into this logic. They are positioned as input, not stakeholder. Policy frameworks struggle to respond because the change is not overtly abusive. Contracts are voluntary. Terms are accepted. Markets appear competitive. Antitrust definitions lag behind functional reality. Control is distributed across interfaces rather than consolidated in a single entity. Power is exercised through design, not coercion. Regulation looks for monopolies. The economy builds ecosystems. The result is a new class of entrepreneur in name only. They register businesses, assume risk, manage operations, and comply with regulations. But they do not set strategy. They do not own demand. They do not accumulate leverage. They exist within parameters defined elsewhere. Their autonomy is conditional on performance metrics they cannot influence. This condition is normalized through cultural narratives. Flexibility replaces stability. Hustle replaces security. Independence is reframed as optional. The ideal entrepreneur becomes adaptable, compliant, always optimizing. Ownership is no longer the goal. Participation is. Success is measured by activity, not accumulation. From a macro perspective, this model appears efficient. It distributes labor and risk while centralizing control and profit. It accelerates scaling. It smooths volatility at the top, but it hollows out the middle. Independent ownership declines. Economic agency concentrates. The ladder remains visible, but the rungs disappear. The small business owner senses this shift intuitively. They feel busy but stagnant. They feel exposed but constrained. They recognize that their role has changed, even if they cannot name the process. They are no longer building something that can stand alone. They are maintaining alignment within a system that does not need them to succeed individually. This is the transition from owner to operator. It is not marked by collapse, but by compliance. Not by failure, but by function. The business continues, but the autonomy that once defined it quietly dissolves. Once the owner becomes an operator, the final illusion to dissolve is control over the future. Strategy used to mean deciding where the business was going. In the new structure, strategy is reduced to adaptation. The future arrives prepackaged, delivered through updates, policy changes, interface redesigns, and revised terms that must be accepted to continue operating. The small business does not plan forward, it responds forward. This shift fundamentally alters risk perception. Traditionally, risk was tied to market uncertainty. Demand fluctuations, competition, and operational mistakes defined exposure. In the operator model, risk is systemic and asymmetric. A single platform decision can instantly reshape revenue, visibility, or cost structure. There is no diversification against this risk because participation itself creates concentration. The more dependent the business becomes, the fewer alternatives remain. Economic data increasingly confirms this transformation, even if it is rarely framed correctly. Measures of self-employment and small business formation remain elevated, while measures of wealth accumulation among small business owners stagnate or decline. More people operate businesses. Fewer own viable assets. Entrepreneurship expands as a category of labor, not capital. This distinction matters because labor does not compound. Ownership does. Globally, platform-mediated income now represents a significant share of small business revenue across retail, hospitality, transportation, and services. Yet margins within these channels are thinner, more volatile, and less predictable than traditional independent models. The volatility is absorbed entirely by the operator. Platforms extract fees regardless of outcome. Risk is outsourced downward while revenue remains centralized upward. This structure also changes how failure is experienced. When an independent business failed in the past, the cause was often identifiable: competition, demand shifts, mispricing, or poor management. Today, failure is frequently ambiguous. Revenue may disappear without warning. Accounts may be suspended pending review. Rankings may drop without explanation. The operator is left guessing which rule was violated, which metric declined, which invisible threshold was crossed. Accountability dissolves. Anxiety replaces analysis. The legal framework reinforces this imbalance. Terms of service function as unilateral contracts that can be modified at will. Dispute resolution mechanisms favor scale. Arbitration clauses restrict recourse. Small operators lack the resources to contest decisions even when they are incorrect. The cost of resistance exceeds the value of compliance. Rational behavior dictates acceptance, even when outcomes are damaging. Over time, this produces a behavioral shift that is economically significant. Operators stop optimizing for long-term resilience. They optimize for platform approval. Decisions are made to satisfy metrics rather than customers. Innovation narrows to what the system rewards. Risk-taking declines. Differentiation disappears. The market fills with interchangeable operators competing on speed and compliance rather than quality or vision. This homogenization benefits large intermediaries. Standardized supply is easier to manage, predict, and monetize. It reduces complexity. It increases bargaining power. It transforms millions of independent decisions into a controlled flow of activity. The economy appears more orderly. It also becomes more brittle beneath the surface. Labor relations further entrench the operator model. The distinction between entrepreneur and worker blurs. Operators work long hours, lack benefits, bear full risk, and yet possess limited control. They are not protected by labor law because they are classified as owners. They are not empowered as owners because they lack leverage. They occupy a legal and economic gap that favors extraction over protection. This gap is expanding. Younger cohorts increasingly enter entrepreneurship not to build assets, but because traditional employment fails to provide security or mobility. They are drawn into platform ecosystems under the promise of flexibility. What they receive is exposure without insulation. The system converts aspiration into throughput. From a policy standpoint, this presents a paradox. Governments celebrate rising entrepreneurship while ignoring declining ownership quality. Support programs focus on access and participation rather than autonomy and leverage. Success is measured by activity counts, not by durability or wealth creation. The operator model satisfies these metrics perfectly. It produces visible effort without demanding structural change. Capital markets reinforce the trajectory. Investment flows toward intermediaries, not operators. Valuations reward those who control interfaces, data, and transaction flows. Those who perform the underlying work are not seen as scalable assets. They are inputs, replaceable, numerous, individually insignificant. This creates a feedback loop that is difficult to escape. As platforms grow, alternatives weaken. As alternatives weaken, dependency deepens. Exit becomes costly. Rebuilding independence requires capital, time, and risk tolerance that operators no longer possess. The door does not slam shut. It quietly narrows until passage is no longer possible. The most profound consequence of this transition is psychological. The identity of ownership erodes. Pride shifts from creation to endurance. Success is redefined as survival within constraints. Ambition contracts. Vision gives way to maintenance. The business continues, but its purpose changes. It exists to comply, not to grow. At the macro level, the economy adapts seamlessly. Output remains stable, services are delivered, consumption flows. The loss is not captured in national accounts because autonomy is not a tracked variable. Independence is invisible to growth metrics. What cannot be measured is quietly removed. This is why the transformation from owner to operator is so complete. It is not resisted because it is not recognized as loss. It is framed as modernization, flexibility, progress. Only those living inside the system feel the difference. They sense that something fundamental has shifted, even as everything appears to function normally. The small business has not disappeared. It has been redefined. It no longer represents ownership, leverage, or independence. It represents participation under conditions set elsewhere. The economy did not eliminate entrepreneurs, it absorbed them. And once absorbed, they no longer shape the system, they sustain it. The final realization arrives quietly. There is no dramatic collapse, no singular event that signals the end of the old economic promise. Instead, clarity emerges through accumulation. Patterns repeat. Outcomes converge, and it becomes impossible to ignore that the system no longer behaves as it once did. The economy has not malfunctioned, it has completed a transition, and in that transition, small independent ownership is no longer a central requirement. From a macroeconomic standpoint, this shift appears rational. Large, centralized systems offer predictability. They stabilize output, smooth volatility, and simplify governance. Fewer entities control more activity, making forecasting easier and intervention more effective. Financial markets reward this structure. Credit flows towards scale because scale reduces uncertainty. Investors prefer intermediaries because intermediaries extract value without bearing operational risk. Policymakers tolerate concentration because it lowers the probability of chaotic failure. Stability is purchased through consolidation. Economic data reflects this preference clearly. Across advanced economies, market concentration continues to rise even during periods of slower growth. Corporate profits at the top decouple from small business income. Productivity gains accrue to large firms while stagnating elsewhere. Capital expenditure favors automation, logistics, and platforms rather than independent producers. Entrepreneurship persists in volume but declines in quality. More businesses exist, fewer endure, fewer accumulate wealth. The signal is consistent across regions and sectors. This is not an accident of technology or globalization alone. It is the outcome of incentives layered over time. Monetary policy prioritized liquidity and asset stability. Fiscal policy favored measurable output. Regulation scaled poorly. Infrastructure was built for throughput. Digital systems optimized for engagement and efficiency. Each decision, reasonable in isolation, reinforced a system that functions best when activity is abundant and control is centralized. Small businesses are compatible with the system only as participants, not as autonomous actors. The economy that emerges from the structure does not hate small businesses. It simply does not rely on them. Independent ownership once served multiple functions. It distributed risk. It localized decision-making. It fostered resilience through diversity. In the current model, these functions are replaced by scale, data, and centralized coordination. Diversity is tolerated only where it does not threaten efficiency. Independence is permitted only where it does not demand leverage. From an investor's perspective, this evolution clarifies strategy. Capital does not seek effort, it seeks position. Ownership of interfaces, infrastructure, and data streams generates durable returns. Ownership of labor-intensive, margin-constrained operations does not. The market values control over participation. This valuation logic drives innovation toward orchestration rather than creation. Platforms multiply. Operators proliferate. The distance between them widens. For the small business owner, this realization is sobering. Many entered entrepreneurship believing it was a path to autonomy, resilience, and long-term security. They discover instead that the system rewards adaptability without empowerment. They are encouraged to work harder, optimize faster, comply more precisely. But these behaviors do not restore leverage. They deepen integration. The promise of eventual independence recedes as participation intensifies. Global events reinforce this trajectory rather than interrupt it. Crises accelerate consolidation, recoveries entrench it. Each shock removes fragile actors and leaves behind those with buffers. Each policy response stabilizes the largest nodes first. Emergency support flows through channels designed for scale. Small businesses receive aid, but rarely gain position. The system emerges stronger, but narrower. This narrowing has consequences that extend beyond economics. Communities lose anchors. Local knowledge erodes. Wealth concentrates geographically and institutionally. Social mobility slows. Risk migrates downward. The economy becomes efficient, but brittle. When flexibility resides only at the top, adaptation slows at the edges. Innovation becomes incremental rather than transformative. The system optimizes itself against disruption, including disruption that could benefit society. Yet the most striking aspect of this transition is how little resistance it generates. The narrative of progress absorbs dissent. Digital convenience masks dependency. Access is mistaken for opportunity. Activity is mistaken for success. Because the economy continues to function, loss is abstract. Because consumption persists, decline is invisible. Because participation remains possible, exclusion feels voluntary. The future that emerges from this structure still includes entrepreneurs, but they look different. They operate within frameworks that do not control. They assume risk without commanding reward. They optimize metrics rather than shape markets. They are flexible, responsive, and replaceable. Ownership becomes rare, concentrated, and increasingly detached from effort. This does not mean small businesses will vanish entirely. They will exist where scale cannot reach, where regulation is light, where margins are irrelevant, or where culture demands locality. But they will not define the economy. They will decorate it. The engine will run elsewhere. Understanding this shift is uncomfortable, because it contradicts deeply held beliefs about work, merit, and reward. It suggests that success is no longer primarily about execution, discipline, or innovation at the individual level. It is about alignment with structures that compound power. Those structures are increasingly inaccessible to those without capital, connections, or institutional positioning. The economy has not become cruel. It has become optimized. And optimization does not care who is left behind, as long as output remains. Small businesses were once essential to how the system balanced growth with resilience. That role has been reassigned. The balance now favors efficiency over independence, control over diversity, and predictability over opportunity. This is the economy that exists now. Not broken, not collapsing, simply transformed. And once that transformation is recognized, the quiet disappearance of small, independent ownership no longer feels mysterious. It feels inevitable. The system did not fail small businesses. It outgrew the need for them. This is not a temporary cycle. It is a completed transition. The economy didn't collapse. It reorganized. If you still believe effort guarantees independence, you are playing by rules that no longer exist. Understanding this is not pessimism. It is the first step towards seeing the system clearly. Because in the economy that's coming, participation is easy, ownership is rare.